Welcome everyone to this next Cursillo talk. I'm Father William Weary. I made the 36th Men's Cursillo in 1984. I started at St. John's de Curia, and I'm pastor here at St. Jude Thaddeus, where this is being filmed, in Mifflintown, and Sacred Heart Church in Lewistown. And we are in chapter 8 of Rediscovering Catholicism by Matthew Kelly, and the chapter is entitled, kind of oddly, Even a Blind Man Knows. And the full quote from page 95 of the book is, "Even a blind man knows when he is in the presence of a great light." And Kelly says, you need to be that light. There's a lot of blindness, spiritual blindness around us today. In this chapter, Matthew Kelly presents examples of holiness to us. Several prime-time examples of great light, expanding thereby on previous chapters where he has exhorted us to be the best version of ourselves through personal holiness and discipline. Holiness, he says, is the goal. The purpose of life is to get holy. I would like to add that when people think of holiness, they might think of the little old lady silently making the Stations of the Cross in church, or the first Holy Communion, 8-year-old child dressed in white hands, folded, posing for the photograph. I suggest to you, when you think of holiness, think of the Hubble telescope photographs. And if you've seen them, the glorious array of solar systems and galaxies and planets and the spiral columns of just millions and millions and millions of stars. Think of holiness that way, and that when you're holy, that's what's inside of you. And that's what's inside the little old lady making the Stations of the Cross and the First Holy Communion student as well. You have the universe inside of you. It's all part and parcel of being the best version of yourself, shining like a light. That's holiness. And to help achieve that, Kelly says that we should be around the best people, read the best books, listen to the best music, look toward the best figures in history. If you're going to be a golfer or a tennis player or a basketball player, study the best athletes of that sport. That helps us to be our best. This, of course, is all the study leg of the tripod, to read and listen to the best. And I agree with Matthew Kelly. And it's what I strive to do as well. I love reading, and I find it hard to find the time, but I try to read the best. Usually theology and philosophy, and I love it. I can't get enough of it. I read a lot of Catholic periodicals as well. I would like to read more biographies and history books like the lives of the presidents, sort of like bucket list reading. There's a lot of that I would like to get in. Every now and then a novel too, but a classic one. I aspire to reading the great novels of all time. I love museums as well. Matthew Kelly mentions artists that he admires. The point is to nourish ourselves with the best. Think of the results when you do that consistently. He quotes St. Catherine of Siena, the 14th century mystic, who says, "If you are what you should be, you'll set the whole world on fire." When we study and read the best, that's what happens, we hope. And I won't go into detail on each saint here, because Kelly does such a great job of summarizing each one. But I will give my own thoughts and impressions, because I love talking about the lives of the saints, who are the best, who set us on fire, shedding light for the blind. And derivatively, we pick up and we study the saints. Jesus Christ, of course, the Bible, great biblical figures, and then the saints throughout history, we catch some of that fire. I'm going to start with my patron, the 19th century French pastor, St. John Vianney, patron saint of parish priests, but recently named the patron of all priest. First of all, I'm going to call him the Prince of Palanca. He was Palanca on steroids. That's what energized his ministry. Extra prayer and sacrifice. Hours before the Blessed Sacrament. Eating 1 potato a day. Matthew Kelly might not like this saying, but there's an old saying, I kind of agree with it. It says, some of the saints are better admired than imitated. Better admired than imitated. And maybe that's true of John Vianney, but we can learn a lot from him. He turned that small, out-of-the-way parish around with his palanca, spending 8 to 12 hours a day in the confessional. Maybe not in the same degree, but in some manner we can imitate his dedication to palanca. It's funny, when Pope St. John Paul II came to France the first trip to France, some church leaders got him aside and said, don't talk about St. John Vianney. He represents an older type of spirituality which we don't follow anymore here in France. It was like they were embarrassed by St. John Vianney. Well, needless to say, Pope St. John Paul II did not follow that advice, but he did speak of John Vianney and extolled him as a model because he was an amazing man. And Pope St. John Paul II is another saint held up by Kelly as an amazing saint, rightly so. Living under both Nazism and communism, he was instrumental in bringing down the Soviet bloc, which occurred without the firing of one shot, or without the dropping of one bomb, without the shedding of any blood. If you'd have told me that as a kid growing up in the Cold War, I would have said you were crazy. I would have said it would have taken a major war to bring down the Soviet Empire, and it's like overnight it happened. Largely, I believe, through the prayer and palanca of Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, others as well, but through Pope St. John Paul II, who had a very deep devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, who appeared, in 1917 to the 3 children in Portugal, and at the beginning of this horrendous 20th century, there would be 2 world wars. It would be the Holocaust, the gulags of Soviet Russia, the dropping of the bombs of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It would be a horrendous century, so I could see where Our Lady would appear to them. And John Paul II latched on to Fatima, and when he was shot, attributed that to his being saved to Our Lady of Fatima. Took the bullet, you remember, and took that bullet that he was shot with, put it in the crown of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Fatima. As a young auxiliary bishop, he attended the Second Vatican Council, and as Pope in the post-Vatican II era, solidified correct theological and doctrinal thinking through his books, encyclicals, homilies, and speeches. I think especially of the theology of the body and the encyclical Veritatis Splendor. We can imitate his love for the truth. Mother Teresa of Calcutta is another saint mentioned by Kelly. She moved the world with her kindness to the poor and destitute. Kelly quotes her saying, I believe in person-to-person contact. Every person is Christ for me. And since there is only one Jesus, the person I am meeting is the one person in the world at that moment, unquote. She was instrumental in the conversion of Malcolm Muggeridge, the British writer who had been atheist. Kelly says that she was a woman of prayer, spending hours per day before the Blessed Sacrament. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the United States Medal of Freedom, and the United States Albert Schweitzer Prize. Yet she was not swayed by these honors and remained steadfastly dedicated in her service to the poor and the humble. we can imitate that self-sacrifice for others, especially the vulnerable and the helpless. My favorite saint, also extolled by Matthew Kelly, is St. Thomas More, martyred in England in the year 1535. I think he's my favorite because he was a lawyer and my father was a lawyer. Before we had this plethora of more or less contemporary saints canonized over the last recent decades by Pope St. John Paul II, when I was growing up, there didn't seem to be a lot of down-to-earth, everyday saints, somebody really to relate to, and not a lot of layperson saints, it seemed to me, certainly not husbands and fathers, mostly bishops, monks, and nuns, except for Thomas More. For Thomas More. He was canonized in 1920, and he was a husband and father. I think I first got onto him with the great movie, Man for All Seasons, 1967, based on the stage play. He was a husband, father, went to work every day as an attorney, ran a household, worked in government, a modern man, although the 16th century, but someone a 21st, 20th century person could relate to. And then, what courage! He was appointed Lord Chancellor of England by his admirer, King Henry VIII, but More fell out of favor with the king for not going along with the king's divorce from Queen Catherine, and for the king's subsequent marriage to Anne Boleyn. And what really did More in was his refusal to sign the oath of succession that everybody had to sign, agreeing that the English monarch was head of the church in England over the Pope. In the stage play, A Man for All Seasons, there was a heart-wrenching scene where More's wife and children come into his jail cell begging him to sign the oath. But he was adamant and refused. All 25 or so bishops of the British Isles of that time signed the oath, becoming thereby the first Anglican Episcopalian bishops, except for St. John Fisher of Rochester, England, the only one who was martyred about the same time as More. We can all stand to imitate, in this day and age, Thomas More's courage. More's favorite saint was St. Francis of Assisi, also mentioned by Kelly, who lived and died some 300 years before Thomas More. Francis of Assisi was canonized only a few years after his death. Very unusual for that time. Usually took a couple hundred years to be canonized. I was struck by Matthew Kelly's analysis of that era. I had never heard this before, that coins, always around since ancient times, Roman Empire and before, began to be mass-produced in the 13th century, Francis's time, allowing for a massive accumulation of wealth, such as you could not do before with chickens and goats and eggs so much, but now with coins you can do that. And so there came this preoccupation with wealth, certainly on the part of Francis's father, a prosperous cloth merchant. Francis stood against this idolatry of money and embraced lady poverty. And after a dissolute, carefree youth and a short bout as an unsuccessful soldier and prisoner of war, he founded the Franciscan order. He had a crisis after the wartime experience, began wandering the countryside, became much more spiritual, talking to God, and eventually founded the Franciscan order, a movement that spread throughout Europe during his lifetime, capturing the imagination of the Christian world at that time. Matthew Kelly writes, "His spirit of uncompromising commitment to the gospel has remained a force of renewal in the church in every place and time for more than 700 years. You and I can certainly imitate his simplicity." So, catch the fire, Matthew Kelly. would say, from saints like these and others, and from saints around you. They are all around. They're embedded in your family, your neighborhood, your parish, in the Cursillo movement. They're there. Be one of them and be a light for the blind to see. De Colores.